Dexter Morgan is a brilliant killer, but he's fiction. The men we're about to compare him to, they were real, and far more terrifying. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Zodiac Killer, BTK, Jack the Ripper, Ed Gein, and John Wayne Gacy. These weren't TV characters playing monsters, they were monsters. So how does Dexter stack up against the darkness that actually walked among us?
Calm down and I won't have to. I just get all emotional.
Jeffrey Dahmer was the stuff of nightmares. His childhood was horrid, and from that difficult upbringing, he would go on to do monstrous things. Jeffrey's mother and father were in his life, but it's been reported that they weren't exactly present. His mother was likely suffering from undiagnosed mental illnesses, and his father was very busy with work. His mother was often too depressed or distracted to show him the attention a child really needs or deserves. His father tried to connect with him through shared interests like science and the preservation of animal bodies, but he didn't notice the deep issues that Jeffrey was dealing with. Eventually, Dahmer's parents would divorce, and his mother would leave town with his younger brother. This left Jeffrey alone with no real support or supervision. It was the same year of his parents' separation, 1978, that he would commit his first murder when he was only 18 years old. His victim was a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, who was just trying to make his way to a concert. After he murdered Hicks, Jeffrey wouldn't kill again for nearly 10 years, but once he started up again, it happened at a pretty consistent pace, with a few happening every year until he was finally caught in 1991. And he used a relatively standard method to capture his victims, but they weren't all murdered in the exact same way. It's also important to note that Dahmer was a heavy drinker, even in high school. He needed to drink to be social, and once he had the courage to socialize with others, he could begin his sick process. He would appear friendly to his intended target, offering them rides, drinks, drugs, anything really to get them to let their guard down and follow him back to his house. Once he was there, he would usually incapacitate them by drugging them with a drink spiked with sedatives. Some he would get so drunk that they passed out on their own. Once they were defenseless, Dahmer would strangle his victims to death before dismembering them. Some of their body parts he would keep, some parts he would eat, some parts he would just destroy. His methods were truly nightmarish and horrific. He truly deserved a fate worse than death for what he did to those innocent young men. And what was truly disgusting about Dahmer was that he had no qualms about hurting children. His oldest victims could be in their early 30s, but his youngest would be as young as 14. What was equally as disturbing is that he only targeted young men that police would consider quote-unquote less dead, usually gay or bisexual men who were non-white, all of whom had little resources or money. By targeting vulnerable men that society deemed unimportant, Jeffrey ensured that he would remain free to continue killing for years. The deaths of his victims weren't heavily investigated, so he wasn't either. His own family didn't even look too closely at what he was up to. He flew under the radar for years, and as a result, many people were killed and wouldn't receive justice for many years. Jeffrey Dahmer was a prolific serial killer, and he did manage to avoid detection for a long time, but that obviously wouldn't be a problem for Dexter. If anything, it would have made it easier for Dexter to eliminate him. Had Dexter ever caught wind of what Jeffrey Dahmer was doing, he'd have killed him with no problem at all, and he wouldn't even have to worry about outpacing the police to get to him. Sure, Dahmer was pretty sly as a predator, but as a killer, he was horribly messy and disorganized. He was always drunk, and even as a high-functioning alcoholic, Dexter's poise and long-standing sobriety would provide him the first advantage of many he would have over Dahmer. Let's remember that, much like Jeffrey Dahmer, Dexter's fourth ever victim, Levi Reed, was also a man who was regularly heavily intoxicated. And despite the fact that Dexter had just started out on his journey as a killer with a code, he was able to take Levi out with no problem. Levi made the mistake of stumbling around Miami at night, drunk and high, creating the perfect opportunity for Dexter to get to him. A serial killer himself, Levi also made the perfect victim for Dexter. On top of that, he was able to avoid a conviction due to sloppy police work on Harry Morgan's part, clearing the path for Dexter to be the one to deliver justice. And like Jeffrey Dahmer, some of Levi Reed's victims were children, something Dexter notoriously despises. Knowing that someone hurt kids has always brought out Dexter's most dangerous side. Once, he even took out a man who was not actually a killer, but was known to prey on children in other ways. Nathan Stephen Martin was a man who had been previously convicted for assaulting a child, maybe more than one. Even though he was eventually released from prison, he had to register as a sex offender, and it's a good thing he did. He was still preying on children, following them around, watching them in public, and taking creepy pictures of them. His final mistake would be targeting Dexter's stepdaughter, Aster. When Dexter found out what he was up to, he broke into Nathan's house and strangled him to death to protect his kids and any other kids Nathan may have been victimizing. Even though not every victim of Dahmer's was a minor, a few of them were. Knowing that, Dexter would be more interested than usual in getting rid of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dexter's determination is yet another disadvantage for Dahmer. Besides Al Jolly Walker, can you name anyone else who has ever managed to evade Dexter's table once they were on his radar? And Dahmer would never see Dexter coming. How could he? Dexter plans. Dahmer reacts. He was so used to being the hunter that he'd probably never expect to become the hunted. Like most of Dexter's targets, Dahmer's false sense of superiority and the assumption that he was safe would be yet another advantage for Dexter. Dexter could stalk Dahmer and even get close to him without ever being noticed. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer realized he was in any danger, it would be far too late for him. He couldn't even manage to keep his neighbors from becoming suspicious because the way that he disposed of his victims' bodies was so haphazard. His entire apartment reeked of decomposing bodies, and he left evidence all around it. Finding him would be child's play for someone like Dexter. Dexter is an expert in forensics and has analyzed countless crime scenes. He knows what death smells like, and there is no doubt that Dahmer would have its stench all over him. That and all of the evidence Dahmer had laying around his apartment would make Dexter's vetting process incredibly simple. And watching Jeffrey lure an innocent and vulnerable man back to his apartment would be enough to trigger Dexter's sense of justice and urge to kill. During his killing spree, Jeffrey Dahmer killed at least 17 people and assaulted many others. And who knows if every victim was even accounted for. Of course, not everyone that Dexter killed was a bona fide serial killer, but plenty of them were. The ice truck killer, the Trinity killer, the Doomsday killer, the brain surgeon. They were all far more intelligent and efficient than Dahmer ever really was, and Dexter was able to deal with them. Compared to them, Jeffrey Dahmer was a novice when it came to killing. He had far fewer victims than Trinity and ITK, and he was caught way sooner. If Dexter was able to handle them, what would make Dahmer any more of an issue? Another disadvantage on Dahmer's part is that he was highly emotional. He struck out when he felt rejection, and he often made rash decisions in moments of weakness, even when he may have been caught as a result. That is not something that Dexter has to contend with. Could Dexter become emotional? Of course, but that was rare, and it hardly ever impacted his process. His focus and precision compared to Dahmer's thoughtless recklessness would definitely make it easier for Dexter to finally put a stop to his murder spree. But how would Dexter even find him? Well, Dahmer's carelessness would do the work for him. Dexter could easily pose as a potential victim. Dahmer typically chose younger men as his victims, but if Dexter seemed desperate or vulnerable enough, he could have seemed appealing to Dahmer as an easy target, regardless of his age. If Dexter placed himself in Dahmer's orbit, pretending to be a hitchhiker or a drunk guy in a gay bar, it would be difficult for Dahmer to resist the urge to possess him. Dexter has tricked so many of his victims using fake names and acting the part to ignite their dark urges. He would get on their good sides, at times even making them believe that he was a kindred spirit even. When he wanted to take out Matt Chambers, a serial drunk driver who had amassed plenty of victims due to his selfish behavior, Dexter pretended to be a drunk himself to get more information. Chambers never suspected a thing. And when he wanted to get rid of Emmett Meridian, a sick psychiatrist who had pushed patients kill themselves, he made up a fake name and pretended to be a new patient. In another scenario, he used the pseudonym Kyle Butler and pretended to be a church-going divorcee to get closer to Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer. And those are only a few examples. He used the fake name Patrick Bateman to get Tony Farrar on his kill table, and when he needed to secure M99 for his rituals, he used the same name to keep people off his trail. And when everything finally hit the fan at the end of the original series, Dexter created an entirely completely new identity as Jim Lindsay so he could live in Iron Lake, New York without being identified. And everyone bought it hook, line, and sinker. He was frighteningly good at creating these false personas and using them to satiate his urges. Time and time again, Dexter acted as a wolf in sheep's clothing to make sure that he was able to take out the people he had his sights set on. Jeffrey Dahmer isn't any smarter or more cautious than the people Dexter's ploys have worked on before. If anything, he was dumber, more easily fooled. Dahmer was dumber, more vulnerable to something like that than any of them, and more than he would think. Even one slightly convincing performance from Dexter and Dahmer would be just another unassuming piece of garbage to fall for Dexter's act and end up with a knife in his chest or a reciprocating saw against his neck. Dexter is just too good at it all, and Dahmer was just some drunken asshole who felt he had the right to kill people to cure his unending loneliness. And if they ever met in Dahmer's final moments, it would be his torturous loneliness that Dexter could use against him to give him the fate that he earned. And of course, not long after they were alone, Jeffrey would try to begin his nauseating ritual, but it would be no use. Dexter has already used the whole spiked drink trick on Gareth Pike, the Gemini killer. Dexter even had the foresight to give Gareth the drink without M99 in it, correctly anticipating that Gemini would switch them at the last second and end up serving himself the drink laced with the tranquilizer in it. He wouldn't fall for the same trick himself. Dahmer's entire procedure would be ruined before it ever began. And of course, Dexter would have no interest in playing coy for long. All Jeffrey would need to do is look away or turn his back, and there'd be a needle in his neck. He would wake up unrobed, wrapped in plastic, surrounded by pictures of his known victims, and finally experience the same sense of fear and helplessness he forced on so many others. When he was finally apprehended, Jeffrey Dahmer showed remorse and accepted responsibility for what he had done. He had no interest in shifting blame or denying his crimes, which is what monsters like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy did after they were finally stopped. He also insisted that people didn't look at his parents or his upbringing as reasons to explain away what he had done. He doesn't deserve any points for taking responsibility, though. He was responsible. When offers began searching Dahmer's apartment, the scene truly defied any sort of human decency and even comprehension. Inside his refrigerator sat the severed head of a man, which was placed on the shelf as if it were just an item of food. As investigators continued this search, the full extent of Dahmer's atrocities came to light. In the kitchen, they uncovered 4 more human heads. The refrigerator also held 2 human hearts, and in his bedroom, they found 7 skulls arranged like grim trophies. The freezer hid a human torso, and other parts of the apartment had even more horrors. There were preserved organs, 2 full skeletons, severed hands, genitals, torsos, and more left to rot or decompose in acid. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most deranged people to ever exist, and he continues to shock and horrify everyone who learns of his unthinkable crimes. What he did to all those innocent people was so evil that there is nothing he could possibly say or do to make up for it, besides eliminating himself before he had the chance to hurt all of those men. Acknowledging that he was a disgusting, irredeemable, hideous monster in front of anyone who would listen was the least Dahmer could have done. Eventually, Jeffrey Dahmer would be beaten to death by another prisoner after being sentenced to life in prison. And many people believe that that was exactly what Dahmer deserved, if not worse. Even if he had to meet Dexter or anyone like him, that would probably have been too gentle a fate for a maniac like Dahmer. Still, if it were possible for them to have ever come face to face, Jeffrey Dahmer wouldn't have stood a chance against Dexter Morgan, and he would have gotten everything that was coming to him, to say the least. Of course, Dexter only exists in fiction, but if he didn't, this wouldn't even be a question. Most people think of Dexter as just another TV serial killer, but he's actually a trained assassin who specifically hunts other killers. See, Dexter Morgan isn't your typical psychopath. This guy was literally molded from childhood to be the perfect killing machine. After watching his mother get murdered with a chainsaw when he was just 3 years old, he got adopted by a Miami Metro cop named Harry Morgan. And Harry wasn't just any cop. He was a detective who recognized what Dexter was becoming and decided to channel it. Harry created what's known as the Code, which is basically a set of rules that turn Dexter's homicidal urges into vigilante justice. Rule 1, don't get caught. Rule 2, never hurt an innocent. Rule 3, make sure your target deserves it. This wasn't some random deranged serial killer development. This was systematic training. But here's what makes him terrifying. Dexter didn't just learn to kill. He learned to kill smart. He attended medical school and was at the top of his class before switching to forensics, which gave him expert knowledge of human anatomy and crime scene analysis. He became a forensic blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Homicide Department, meaning he literally studied murder methods all day, then honed and perfected his own techniques. His physical training is insane too. We're talking about a guy who's proficient in jiu-jitsu, knows pressure points, and has years of close quarters combat experience. In the show, he regularly goes up against ex-military, other serial killers, and trained fighters. Dexter's also about 5'11" and in great shape. He runs, lifts weights, swims. In his prime, he wasn't some out-of-shape couch potato. This guy can carry adult bodies, snap necks with his bare hands, and has the stamina to chase targets through multiple city blocks. And that's just the beginning of his advantages. His methods are what really set him apart. Dexter doesn't just randomly kill people. He stalks them for weeks, sometimes months. He learns their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. He has access to police databases, criminal records, and forensic equipment. When he's ready to make his move, he uses M99 tranquilizer to subdue targets without a fight. Then comes the ritual. Dexter wraps entire rooms in plastic, straps his victims to tables, and takes his time. He's got over 150 confirmed kills, and almost all of them were other killers. We're talking about murderers, rapists, child predators, people who knew how to hurt others. And Dexter systematically eliminated each of them. And he isn't some random psychopath. This is a serious predator who was literally trained from childhood to be the perfect killer. So he had years of experience taking down other murderers who were way more dangerous than the killers we are used to hearing about. But what if he had to go up against the infamous Zodiac Killer? Now you might be thinking, okay, but the Zodiac was never caught, so he must be pretty skilled too, right? Well, let's talk about that. The Zodiac Killer built his reputation on mystery and mind games, not actual combat ability. Look, I get why people think the Zodiac was some kind of criminal mastermind. The guy terrorized Northern California for years, sent cryptic letters to newspapers, created unsolvable ciphers, and taunted police while never getting caught. On the surface, that sounds pretty impressive. But when you actually break down what he did versus how he did it, a very different picture emerges. The Zodiac's confirmed kills were David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen at Lake Herman Road. Shot them while they were sitting in a car. Darlene Farron at Blue Rock Springs killed in an ambush attack on people in a parked car, though Michael Mageau survived. Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. He tied her and Brian Hartnell up first, then stabbed them while they were helpless, though Hartnell survived. Paul Stein in San Francisco shot a taxi driver in the back of the head. When you look at his actual methods, every single one of these attacks followed the same pattern. Find isolated victims, use the element of surprise, strike from a distance or when targets are restrained, then disappear quickly. At Lake Berryessa, he wore a hood with a symbol on it and approached the couple while they were having a picnic. He told them he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money. Then he tied them up with clothesline before pulling out a knife. These weren't combat situations, they were executions. The taxi driver killing is probably the most telling. Paul Stein was just doing his job, driving the Zodiac to a destination in San Francisco. The killer shot him point blank in the back of the head, took his wallet and a piece of his shirt, then walked away. There was no struggle, no fight, no resistance to overcome. This reveals something crucial about his real capabilities. The Zodiac succeeded because he carefully chose targets who couldn't fight back. Young couples on dates, a working taxi driver, college students. These weren't hardened criminals or trained fighters. They were regular people living their lives. Even his physical description doesn't scream dangerous combatant. Witnesses described him as heavyset, around 5'8" to 6 foot, weighing between 195 and 200 pounds. He had a stocky build, not exactly the profile of someone built for physical confrontation. His weapons varied, but tell a story about his methods. He used a .22 caliber pistol at Lake Herman Road, but switched to a 9mm for later attacks. The knife at Lake Berryessa was only used after victims were tied up. These weapons were chosen for effectiveness against defenseless people, not for combat situations. The famous ciphers and letters that made him legendary, those came after the murders. He'd mail them to newspapers days or weeks later, always from a safe distance. The psychological warfare was noteworthy, sure, but it happened when he was nowhere near any danger. He was obviously a coward. Being mysterious doesn't equal being dangerous, especially in a fight. Zodiac succeeded because he picked easy targets and disappeared quickly. There's zero evidence he could handle himself against someone who fights back, let alone a trained killer. Which brings us to the most important question. What happens when an ambush predator meets someone who's literally designed to hunt predators? That's where this gets interesting. In a direct confrontation, Dexter has every possible advantage over the Zodiac. Let me break down exactly why that is. First, think about their pure physical capability. Dexter regularly overpowered people who were supposedly tougher than him, like Dokes, a guy who was a Special Forces veteran, trained in hand-to-hand combat, knew how to wield weapons, and had advanced survival tactics. He was paranoid, aggressive, and constantly suspicious of Dexter. In their first real fight, Dexter not only held his own, but actually won. And this was while Dexter was able to maintain his cover as a mild-mannered lab geek to everyone else around him. Later in the series, when Dokes figured out Dexter's secret, they had an underwater fight that should have been impossible for Dexter to win. Dokes was in his element, a trained soldier in a life-or-death situation. But Dexter adapted, used his environment, and came out on top, even, getting a minor gunshot wound to the leg. Then there's the Trinity Killer situation. Arthur Mitchell was a serial killer who'd been operating for over 30 years. He was methodical, just as paranoid as Dokes, and extremely dangerous. When Dexter finally confronted him, it wasn't even close. Dexter outmaneuvered him, captured him, and eliminated him without breaking a sweat. Dexter also has documented feats of pure strength that would be impossible for most people. He regularly carries adult bodies. Dead weight is incredibly difficult to move, but Dexter makes it look easy. He snapped necks with his bare hands, crushed windpipes, and overpowered multiple attackers at once. His jiu-jitsu training isn't just for show either. We've seen him use pressure points to disarm people holding guns. He can disable someone's grip, redirect their momentum, and turn their own weapons against them. This isn't movie magic. These are real martial arts techniques that require years of practice to master. But it gets even worse for Zodiac when you consider what else Dexter has up his sleeve. Dexter's combat experience isn't limited to regular people. He's going up against other killers who were actively trying to murder him. The ice truck killer was his own brother, someone who knew Dexter's methods and weaknesses intimately. The Doomsday Killer started a religious cult with multiple members. The brain surgeon was a neurosurgeon with detailed knowledge of human anatomy and psychology, and a sickeningly detached disposition when it came to taking a human life. Each of these confrontations required Dexter to adapt his tactics, overcome unexpected challenges, and outthink opponents who were specifically targeting him. That's completely different from the Zodiac's experience of attacking unprepared civilians. Zodiac? Heavy-set guy with no combat training who relied entirely on surprise attacks. His only documented physical feat is overpowering college students and taxi drivers, people who weren't expecting violence and had no training to deal with it. When the Zodiac attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa, he had to tie them up before he felt safe enough to use his knife. Think about that. He was so unsure of his ability to control two unarmed college students that he restrained them first. That's not the behavior of someone confident in their combat skills. Even his choice of weapons reveals his limitations. Whether using a .22 caliber or 9mm pistol, he preferred distance weapons that didn't require close contact. And again, the knife attacks were only attempted after victims were already restrained or incapacitated. Dexter literally specializes in taking down killers. His entire method involves studying his targets, learning their patterns, and then systematically dismantling them or using them to his own advantage. Zodiac's psychological games and ciphers mean nothing when you're face to face with someone stronger, faster, and more experienced. And that's not even considering the factor of intelligence. You're probably wondering, but what about Zodiac's famous ability to evade capture? Here's why that actually works against him. Zodiac's evasion tactics were designed for avoiding police, not surviving against another killer. And there is a very important difference. The Zodiac's intelligence was all about misdirection and confusion. He'd send letters with deliberate misspellings to throw off handwriting analysis. He created ciphers that took decades to solve. He called police stations to confess, then disappeared before they could trace the calls. He even sent a piece of Paul Stein's shirt to prove he was the real killer. All of this was brilliant for someone going up against 1960s law enforcement. Police departments didn't communicate well with each other at the time. Forensic science was primitive compared to today. DNA analysis didn't even exist yet. Computer databases were nothing more than science fiction at the time. But Dexter operates in the modern era with tools the Zodiac never had to deal with. Dexter has access to forensic equipment that can analyze trace evidence the Zodiac wouldn't even know he was leaving behind. Modern fingerprint databases, DNA sequencing, fiber analysis, digital communications tracking. All of this would be available to someone with Dexter's law enforcement connections. Plus, he's caught killers who are way more elusive than Zodiac. The Trinity Killer operated for decades across multiple states, changing his method with each kill in his cycle. The Ice Truck Killer knew exactly how police investigations worked and still couldn't stay ahead of Dexter. The Brain Surgeon was literally closely related to someone inside law enforcement and had access to case files and evidence. Dexter still tracked him down. Remember, Dexter isn't just smart. He's smart in exactly the right ways. His forensic expertise means he understands evidence collection and crime scene analysis better than most actual cops. His experience with other killers gives him insights into criminal psychology that would be impossible to fake. This creates a massive problem for Zodiac because all of Zodiac's advantages were environmental, not personal. He succeeded because during his reign of terror, law enforcement was disorganized and under-equipped. He disappeared because communication between police departments was terrible, and forensic science was incredibly limited. Strip away those advantages, and what do you have? An out-of-shape coward who only attacks unarmed civilians from ambush positions when he knows he has the upper hand. His psychological manipulation tactics would never work on someone who's immune to personal intimidation. And Dexter has stared down killers who are far more frightening than the Zodiac. The complex codes and mind games that made Zodiac famous would actually work against him here. All that communication creates evidence. All those letters create patterns. All those phone calls create opportunities for tracking. Dexter's method is the opposite. He studies targets quietly. Using official resources and police databases, he learns their routines without revealing himself. He strikes once, efficiently, and then makes the problem disappear completely. No letters, no games, no taunting, no evidence, just systematic elimination. And his surprise attack methods are useless against someone who's always prepared. Dexter carries tranquilizer, knows self-defense, and has the situational awareness that comes from years of hunting dangerous people. He's not going to be caught off guard by someone approaching his car or knocking on his door. Even people who thought they had Dexter cornered ended up losing to him. Lila West, the Skinner, Stan Liddy, even Sergeant Dokes. They all had him right where they wanted him at one point or another and still couldn't outmaneuver Dexter Morgan. Which leads us to the brutal truth. You might be thinking this seems totally unfair at this point, and honestly, you're absolutely right. This matchup is so one-sided, it's basically unfair to the Zodiac. Think about it this way. We're comparing a fictional character who was specifically designed to be the perfect killer against a real person whose main advantage was operating in a time when catching killers was much harder than it is today. Fan communities have been debating this matchup for years, and the conclusion is always the same: Reddit threads, versus battles, wiki discussions, Comic Vine forums. They all reach the same verdict. Dexter wins 9 times out of 10. And the 10th time is only if something goes catastrophically wrong. The reasons are always the same. Superior combat training on Dexter's part, obviously. Better physical conditioning for him as well. More advanced tools and more stealth with his weapons of choice. Harrison was right. He is a lot like the lab geek version of Batman. Add in all of the access to modern investigative techniques and his experience fighting other killers instead of attacking civilians, and the answer is clear as day. One Reddit user put it perfectly: Dexter would kill him, dice him up, and be back to normal life before anyone knew the Zodiac was missing. Even when people try to argue for the Zodiac, their arguments fall apart under scrutiny. He never got caught. Neither did Dexter for most of his career, and he was operating under much more intense scrutiny. He's unpredictable. Unpredictable to 1960s cops, not to someone who profiles killers for a living. He's patient. So is Dexter, and he's also trained, more motivated, and almost always armed with M99 tranquilizer. The Zodiac has literally no advantages except his real-world status, which doesn't help in a hypothetical fight. Let's run through a realistic scenario. Say the Zodiac tries his usual approach. He identifies Dexter as a target and plans an ambush attack. Maybe he follows Dexter to an isolated location and tries to approach with a weapon. First problem: Dexter's situational awareness. This is a guy who's been hunted by other killers, stalked by suspicious cops, and targeted by revenge-seeking criminals and ex-lovers. He notices when he's being followed. He recognizes threatening behavior. He's not going to be caught off guard like a random couple on a date. Second problem: Dexter's always ready. He carries tranquilizer, knows how to improvise weapons, and has medical knowledge that makes him dangerous even with everyday objects. He'd even break his own bones before he'd let himself die at the hands of another killer. The Zodiac's advantage of surprise disappears when your target is ready for violence and doesn't fear pain. Third problem: if it comes to a physical confrontation, it's over immediately. Dexter has several pounds of muscle to his advantage, years of combat training, and experience fighting people who actually know how to fight. The Zodiac has what exactly? Experience shooting tied up college students and other unsuspecting people. The bottom line is, you're comparing a character designed to be the perfect killer against a real person who only succeeded by picking soft, easy targets. It's like putting a trained Navy SEAL against someone who's only ever mugged elderly people. The skills just don't translate. Dexter was created by writers who wanted to make the most efficient, dangerous, and intelligent killer possible. Every aspect of his character, his training, his methods, his physical abilities, his psychological profile, was designed to make him unbeatable. The Zodiac was a real person with real limitations. He succeeded through careful target selection, environmental advantages, and luck. Take away those flimsy factors and he's just another criminal who'd be way out of his league if he took on Dexter. So here's the final verdict. This isn't even a contest. Dexter wins in every possible scenario: hand-to-hand combat, weapons fight, psychological warfare, investigation and tracking, even raw intelligence. The Zodiac's only chance would be to avoid the confrontation entirely. And even then, Dexter could be tracking him without the Zodiac Killer ever even realizing it until he was belly up on a kill table. When it comes to facing off with Dexter Morgan, anonymity may be the Zodiac's only saving grace. Dennis Rader called himself BTK. Bind, torture, kill. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a sadist who wanted to brand his crimes like a company slogan. But behind that self-appointed nickname was a man who was disturbingly ordinary. He was a church president, a family man, a compliance officer who enforced neighborhood codes. He lived among the people he terrorized, smiling, waving, even scolding them for leaving their grass too long, all while writing taunting letters to police about the murders he committed. BTK killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991. His victims ranged from children to the elderly, and his crimes were methodical, cold, and dripping with ego. He needed to feel in control, to be the smartest man in the room, even when he wasn't. That's where he and Dexter part ways entirely. Dexter's kills were ritualistic, yes, but driven by a warped sense of justice. Raiders, they were purely narcissism wrapped in cruelty. Dexter kills because of his code. BTK killed because of his emptiness. Here's the thing about Dennis Rader. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was a narcissist with delusions of grandeur. A man so desperate for attention that he couldn't help but write letters to the police, send packages to news stations, taunt authorities with cryptic messages. He craved recognition. He wanted the world to know his name, to fear him, to acknowledge his existence. And that need, that pathetic, insatiable need for validation, that's exactly what got him caught. For years, BTK went dormant. After his last kill in '91, he simply stopped. Not because he felt remorse, not because he'd grown as a person. He stopped because he got complacent. He had a wife, 2 kids, a job as the compliance officer, ironically enforcing regulations in his community. He was a church council president, for crying out loud. Dennis Rader lived a double life, and for a while, he managed to keep those lives separate. But in 2004, after 13 years of silence, his ego got the better of him. He started communicating again, sending letters, leaving packages, playing games with law enforcement because he missed the spotlight. He even asked police if they could trace a floppy disk, and when they told him no, he believed them. He actually believed them. That's how much he trusted his own superiority. He sent them a disk, they traced it back to his church computer, and just like that, BTK was done. Arrested in 2005. Not a good year for someone who doesn't understand a floppy disk. Sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. His downfall wasn't sophisticated detective work. It was his own stupidity and desperation to be seen. Now let's talk about Dexter, because if Dennis Rader ever crossed paths with Dexter Morgan, it would be over before BTK even knew it hit him. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Dexter is disciplined. He doesn't kill for ego. He doesn't leave breadcrumbs for police to follow. He doesn't write letters begging for attention like some desperate child screaming, "Look at me," into the void. Dexter kills because of his dark passenger, a need he channels through Harry's code. He's methodical, surgical. He leaves no trace, no evidence, nothing that could lead back to him. For years, he worked alongside Miami Metro Homicide, analyzing crime scenes, processing blood spatter, and getting away with murder right under their noses. And Dennis Rader? He'd be child's play. Let's break down why this isn't even a contest. BTK was sloppy. He left evidence everywhere. Semen at crime scenes, fibers, items stolen from victims that he kept as trophies. During his communications with police, he gave away details only the killer would know, yes, but he also made mistakes, grammatical patterns, linguistic quirks. He practically gift-wrapped himself for law enforcement. Before you watch any further, I'm happy to finally announce that I'm releasing the first limited drop of my t-shirts. At the start, there are only 100 available, so make sure you buy them while you can at dtmerch.store. Enjoy the video. Dexter, on the other hand, is a blood spatter analyst. He knows how to read a crime scene. He knows what investigators look for. You take one look at BTK's work and see every error, every point of sloppiness, every floppy disk moment, every moment of ego overriding caution. Finding Dennis Rader would be almost insulting in its simplicity. BTK needed control, but he lacked discipline. Dennis Rader's murders were just chaotic. He would break into homes without always knowing who'd be there. Sometimes his intended victim wasn't home and he'd have to improvise. Like when he killed Shirley Vienne and her children were in the house. He locked them in a bathroom, but the entire situation was unplanned, just messy. Compare that to Dexter. Every kill is planned down to the last detail. He researches his targets for weeks, sometimes months. He knows their patterns, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He doesn't leave anything to chance. By the time he's ready to strike, he's already 10 steps ahead. And when something does go wrong, which happens because Dexter isn't perfect, he adapts. moves quickly, efficiently. Dennis Rader would never see him coming. BTK craved recognition. Dexter craves invisibility. This is the biggest difference between them. Dennis Rader needed people to know who he was. He sent poems to newspapers. He bragged about his crimes. He wanted credit, acknowledgement, and fear. When the case went cold and people stopped talking about him, he couldn't handle it. His ego literally led him out of retirement and directly into a jail cell. Dexter doesn't want fame. He wants to blend in, be the nice guy at work, the doting stepfather, the helpful colleague. His entire existence depends on not being noticed as anything other than ordinary. That fundamental difference means Dexter would never make the mistakes Rader made. He'd never send a floppy disk to police. He'd never taunt investigators. The only time he did was when he was dating Lila West in season 2 and sent an anonymous letter to Miami Metro to throw the FBI off his trail. But let's be honest, that was more crazy pulled out of Lila's playbook. Imagine this scenario. Dexter, Miami Metro's blood spatter expert, gets wind of a series of bizarre strangulations out of Kansas. The scenes are staged. Ropes, bindings, trophies missing from the victims' homes. To most, the killer is a ghost. To Dexter, it's a signature. It wouldn't take long. A man who lectures neighbors on lawn violations while writing letters about his murders. Dexter would find the irony poetic. He'd slip into Wichita under a fake name, maybe posing as a forensics consultant, or even bringing his projection of Brian along with him just to keep things interesting. Rader, smug in his anonymity, would probably enjoy the attention, unaware he was letting the wolf in the door. Dexter would play the part, compliment Rader's discipline, even let him talk about how misunderstood he felt. Then, one night, BTK would wake up staring at the familiar glaze of plastic wrap wall of photos showing every person he ever hurt, every letter he ever wrote, every victim he left behind. Dexter wouldn't need to say much. Just a quiet whisper, "You wanted someone to notice you. Well, I noticed." So how would Dexter actually take down Dennis Rader? Let's walk through it. Step 1, discovery. Dexter would notice the pattern. Multiple murders in Wichita, long gaps between kills, victims of varying demographics. He'd see the behavioral signature, the binding, the control, the sexual component. And if Rader started communicating again, sending his little letters and packages, Dexter would be fascinated. Not impressed, not intimidated. Fascinated by the sheer arrogance. Step 2, research. Dexter would dig into every detail. He'd analyze the crime scenes, the victimology, the communications. He'd profile BTK the same way he profiled Trinity, the ice truck killer, and the Doomsday Killer. And he'd come to the same conclusion any competent analyst would. BTK is a narcissist who can't help himself. That's the weakness. That's the opening. Step 3, the trap. Dexter wouldn't need to pose as a victim. That's not BTK's hunting ground. Rader broke into homes. He didn't lure people like Dahmer did. No, Dexter would do something far more elegant. He'd feed BTK's ego. We've seen it before with the Gemini Killer twins, and I'd say he passed with flying colors. They might say that too, but they can't really speak for themselves anymore. Maybe Dexter poses as a journalist interested in unsolved cases. Maybe he even carefully, anonymously, reaches out through channels Rader would monitor, dangling the possibility of acknowledgement, of being truly understood. Dennis Rader wouldn't be able to resist. He'd reach out. He'd want to share, to brag, to finally be appreciated by someone who gets it. And once he did, Dexter would have him in his web. Step 4, the kill room. By the time Dennis Rader realized he'd been played, he'd be wrapped in plastic, surrounded by photos of his victims. And Dexter would make it clear, this isn't about ego. This isn't about games. This is about justice for people whose lives were stolen by a pathetic little man who thought he was special. BTK prided himself on control, but in his final moments, he'd have none. Let's compare their track records. Dennis Rader killed 10 people over 17 years and got caught because he sent a floppy disk to police. Dexter Morgan killed hundreds across multiple decades, was only caught because he tried to save his son, made increasingly reckless decisions after Rita's death, and eventually chose to disappear rather than face consequences. Even in Dexter's worst moments, he was falling apart emotionally. He was still smarter than BTK at his best. Trinity Killer? Arthur Mitchell was methodical, disciplined, and killed for decades across multiple states, and Dexter still took him down. The Ice Truck Killer? Rudy Cooper, aka Brian Moser, was Dexter's own brother, knew how he thought, and still ended up being killed by Dexter. The Doomsday Killer? Travis Marshall was being manipulated by a twisted mentor who was really actually dead and had religious delusions, more complex psychologically than anything Rader could muster. And Dexter eliminated him all the same. Dennis Rader isn't even in the same league. He's not smart enough, he's not disciplined enough, and definitely not careful enough. He's just another monster with an ego problem, and that would be his undoing. Dennis Rader thought he was special. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. He thought his crimes made him important, significant, or worthy of attention and fear. But if you ever encountered Dexter Morgan, you'd learn the truth. He's not special. He's not brilliant. He's not even particularly interesting. He's just another killer who deserves exactly what's coming to him. A needle in the neck, plastic wrap, and the cold, final realization that he was never in control at all. This wouldn't be a contest. It would be an execution. Jack the Ripper remains one of history's most notoriously elusive killers. Operating in London's Whitechapel district in 1888, he brutally murdered at least 5 women over the short span of just a few months. The exact number of his kills is still debated, with some estimating that Jack the Ripper may have had as many as 11 victims, but the 5 confirmed murders are known as the canonical 5. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all known sex workers in the area, and unfortunately the higher risks associated with their lifestyles made them more susceptible to becoming victims of the Ripper. What made Jack the Ripper stand out wasn't just the savagery of his crimes, but the uncanny precision he had when he carried them out. His victims were found with their throats slit and their bodies butchered. This suggested that the Ripper was not only filled with unanswered rage, but also had a disturbing understanding of human anatomy. The incisions he left on his victims were made with a level of skill that implied advanced medical knowledge, leading many to believe that he may have had surgical training, all of which made the idea of Jack the Ripper all the more frightening. I mean, just imagine if a random respected member of the community was helping patients during the day and stalking the streets at night. The world looks a lot less safe when we remember that monsters come in all shapes, sizes, and professions. We may never see the threat coming until it's too late, and Jack the Ripper is a constant reminder of that fact. The press heavily covered the murders, and public panic surged as letters from someone claiming to be from the Ripper were sent into newspapers and police stations. Some of these letters, like the infamous From Hell letter, described the killings in horrific detail, heightening the aura of mystery surrounding him. But we have to keep in mind that the Ripper's crimes occurred in an era before modern forensic science, which helped him evade capture. The police had to rely heavily on eyewitness accounts and underdeveloped detective techniques, neither of which were exactly effective in tracking a killer who worked under the cover of night, often in dense fog on the streets. So, despite countless investigations and theories over the years, the true identity of Jack the Ripper has never officially been proven. Suspects have ranged from, of course, the Polish hairdresser, to local butchers, to physicians, and even members of the British aristocracy. What makes Jack the Ripper so enduring in popular culture was all the questions left lingering. His case is an unsolved puzzle and the birth of modern serial killer mythology. His crimes exposed the failings of Victorian society. All of the poverty, class division, and a lack of social protection for women were on full display in the Ripper's wake. The underwhelming investigation into who he really was and how to stop him revealed the dark underbelly of an age otherwise associated with progress and refinement. Ultimately, Jack the Ripper's mystery and notoriety made him more than just a murderer. He was a symbol of fear and fascination, a shadowy figure who thrived in an era of ignorance and superstition. Over a century later, his legacy continues to haunt criminology, inspiring plenty of fictional stories centered on killers in an attempt to recapture his mystique. But beneath all the confusion he created, there is a stark truth. Jack the Ripper was less of a criminal mastermind and more of a predator who exploited the vulnerabilities of his time. And it's precisely those limitations that would make him no match for a hunter like Dexter Morgan. Jack the Ripper existed in a world without DNA testing, fingerprint databases, or even standardized crime scene photography. His ability to evade capture wasn't because he was some evil genius, it was because the system designed to catch him didn't exist yet. He thrived in a technological void. Now place him in Dexter's world, whether Miami or New York, the modern police would make a mockery of Jack the Ripper. A world with surveillance cameras on every block, satellite tracking, cell phone triangulation, drones, and advanced forensics would make him look like an overly confident amateur. Jack's time-consuming public dissections would make him a simple enough case for Miami Metro. He'd leave a trail of blood, skin cells, footprints, and who knows what else everywhere. Miami Metro locked in on the ice truck killer using a lozenge wrapper he left at the crime scene where he held Anthony Tucci. ITK was way more careful than the Ripper, and he was still caught. Both Dexter and the detectives at Miami Metro eventually learned his true identity and tracked him down. Dexter was even able to trick ITK and manipulate him into a trap and lure him to his death. Much like ITK, Jack the Ripper went around killing women with lower social status and leaving their remains throughout the city to intentionally be found by police. But unlike ITK, the Ripper's methods were less refined and almost implied a high level of compulsion. If the confrontation took place in modern times, Jack would instantly be at a disadvantage. He would likely be on Dexter's radar almost instantly. Within days of his first grisly kill, Dexter would have access to every police photo, every autopsy report, and every piece of blood evidence. He'd analyze the shit out of those spatter patterns, the weapon angles, the incision depth, and the timeline, and within a week, he'd know the killer's height, dominant hand, likely occupation, and area of operation, and more. Even if it took weeks, Dexter would take his time to vet the potential perpetrators until he found out who was responsible. Think about it, Dexter almost always gets his man. Plenty of the people who ended up on his table were trying their best to fly under the radar in some sort of way. Some of them were basically completely off the grid, and Dexter got to them regardless. Ronald Red Schmidt, the dark passenger who was terrorizing rideshare drivers in New York City, went to incredible lengths to hide his identity. He had no online presence, lived alone, and even wore a specialized hoodie so that he couldn't be captured by cameras when he was orchestrating a kill. He didn't have any children, family, or partners that could be used to track him down either. Even with all of this, Dexter found him in 3 days, and that was without any police assistance. There is just no chance that Jack the Ripper would have been more difficult to hunt down than Red, the stealthiest serial killer Dexter has ever set his sights on. Once Dexter saw his disgusting crimes, Jack the Ripper would be ripe for the picking. Now reverse it. Put Dexter in Jack's 1888 London. No cameras, no labs, no databases. Does Dexter fall apart without technology? Nah, not even close. Dexter's efficiency doesn't depend on modern tools. Those just make his job tracking killers down faster and easier. His true skill lies in his aptitude for pattern recognition, psychological analysis, deduction, and human behavior mapping. In 1888, Dexter would still be a master at tracking people. He would study the similarities shared by the victims, cross-reference sightings of possible suspects, map out the locations of the attacks, and use behavioral prediction to find the Ripper in due time. Dexter would adapt, blend in, and use the chaos to his advantage as always. The same darkness that Jack the Ripper hid inside of would become Dexter's camouflage. Just like with Red, Dexter wouldn't need fancy tools or police advantages to find the Ripper. In both timelines, one thing is constant. Dexter thrives both in structure and in chaos. Jack only remains active and free in a world with no advanced forensics and no one like Dexter around. Dexter's forensic mind would build a psychological and physical profile of the Ripper faster than any task force could. Once he had that profile, it would only be a matter of time before he narrowed down the suspect list to one man. The fact of the matter is that as soon as someone smarter enters the game, the luck for Jack the Ripper ends pretty quickly. A showdown between Dexter Morgan and Jack the Ripper would be a clash between two killers separated by time, method, and intelligence, and it wouldn't be a fair fight. Dexter is the evolved predator, trained to hide and kill from a young age. He was also incredibly smart. He was top of his class in college and very well trained in the field of forensics, criminal psychology, and technology. Jack the Ripper, while terrifying in his era, relied on unpredictable confusion, anonymity, and the dark elements of 19th century London to stay hidden. Put them in the same world, whether in Victorian London or modern Miami, and Dexter's meticulous, calculated approach would easily allow him to expose and eliminate the Ripper before he even realized he was being hunted. Summed up, the point is that Dexter would get Jack on the ropes with little issue. The Ripper's sloppiness would be his downfall. His crimes were gruesome, but they lacked strategy beyond the choice of vulnerable victims and dimly lit streets. His reliance on the police's uncertainty and public panic might have worked for him back in his day, but in a world with more sophisticated tools and methods, that formula would be obsolete. And even if Dexter were somehow transported to Victorian London and was stripped of modern tools, all of his book smarts and training would still set him apart. He would adjust quickly, understanding how to exploit Jack's patterns and ego while honoring the first rule of his code to never get caught. Basically, where the police failed because they didn't understand the psychology of a serial killer, Dexter would succeed because he is one. The key difference between Dexter and Jack the Ripper lies in both their motives and ability to exercise control. Jack the Ripper killed impulsively, driven by rage and random impulse. His crimes were messy expressions of dominance and misogyny, not methodical acts of purpose. Dexter, on the other hand, follows the code, his father's strict moral guidelines that channels his dark urges toward those who deserve it. This discipline is what makes him so lethal. He doesn't kill out of frenzy, he kills with intention. Against the Ripper, Dexter's patience would be his greatest weapon. He would study the Ripper, blend into his surroundings, and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. In a modern setting, Dexter would likely infiltrate the investigation into the murders himself, pretending to be an expert consultant or analyst of some sort. While the police floundered, Dexter would quietly track the killer's movements. Once he found the Ripper's hunting grounds, which included various dark alleys, streets near brothels, or largely abandoned parts of town, he'd set a trap. The Ripper, driven by his ritualistic compulsion, wouldn't be able to resist returning to familiar territory. Dexter would be waiting, calm and precise, turning the tables on the hunter. How many times has Dexter taken down one of his targets by catching them off guard in the dark, just as they were about to try to pull off another attack? In Resurrection, there is a great example of this. After meeting Lowell Sloan at the dinner party for serial killers organized by Leon Prater, Dexter realized in no time that Lowell had to be the first to go. Known as the Tattoo Collector, Lowell planned on skinning and killing his next victim while he was in New York, and he planned to do it within a few days of having met Dexter. Once Dexter knew this, he called Lowell up for a drink and then followed him as he closed in on the young woman he planned to victimize. Lowell and his victim were walking up a dark street with few witnesses, and Lowell planned to knock her out using anesthesia before taking her away to be flayed. But Dexter turned the tables on him, using the gas on Lowell without the young woman even ever realizing how close she had just come to death. In just a few moments after that, Lowell was strapped to a kill table with a knife buried in his chest, and his body parts found their way to a furnace to eliminate any evidence. It was almost too easy for a predator like Dexter, and the Tattoo Collector isn't the only killer Dexter was able to catch using the cover of night. Levi Reed was another serial killer Dexter got to as he was distracted late at night in an alleyway. Dexter snuck up behind him and stuck him with an M99 tranquilizer and got Levi on his table in no time. So we can see clearly that while working at night seemed to be useful for Jack the Ripper when he only had the police to worry about, operating in the dark would only make Dexter's job of eliminating him even easier. As a killer himself, and a far more prolific and proficient one, having to find the Ripper at night would only be an advantage for Dexter. And what's more is that if the showdown took place in modern days, Dexter would have no issue getting rid of the body and leaving no evidence. So he would definitely get away with this extrajudicial justice as usual. But if it happened in the 1800s, he would have an even easier time evading capture. He wouldn't have to worry about all the plastic wrap and gloves. Fingerprints weren't used to convict anyone until the very early 1900s, and even then it wasn't widespread yet. Jack the Ripper left the bodies of his victims out in plain sight because he knew that there would be no way for authorities to trace them back to him. Dexter would have the exact same advantage. He could kill Jack and flee without even having to concern himself with disposing of the body. No chopping, bagging, or dumping required, unless he just felt like it, of course. There is just no way that Dexter would get caught after killing the Ripper when the Ripper managed to stay undetected after committing 5 murders, if not more. So the hardest part of Dexter's job in facing off with Jack the Ripper would be hunting him down, and as previously discussed, that wouldn't be that hard either. Because he was never captured or identified, little is known about the physical abilities of the Ripper, but given his MO, it's not too far-fetched to assume he wasn't exactly physically menacing or intimidating. Think about his ideal victim. Jack the Ripper never attacked men, opting instead to go after underprivileged women. The women were almost definitely smaller than him, and he could easily overpower them if necessary, something he probably wouldn't have felt so confident doing with a man. But even given the smaller stature of the women, he still didn't seem to engage in any hand-to-hand combat with. Instead, he chose to use sharp tools to control, subdue, murder, and mutilate them. He was clearly a coward with no confidence in his ability to take on someone his own size, and for all we know, that size could have been below average for him. This is just another reason that going up against Dexter would go poorly for Jack the Ripper. Dexter has no problem with fighting with his hands. He's strong, even well into his midlife, and he's trained in jiu-jitsu. He's taken on plenty of other trained killers who were physically intimidating and still managed to come out on top. He has scuffled with some people, as strong as Dokes and as agile as Zoe Kruger. He has moved bodies as big as Little Chino and Ray Speltzer, and they were massive compared to him. Not only that, but Dexter has been stabbed during altercations, shot in the leg while handcuffed, pretty sure he got in a car accident at least twice, and even shot directly in the chest, and none of that was enough to keep him down. So if he and Jack the Ripper were ever alone together in a dimly lit alley, even if Jack saw Dexter coming after him, it wouldn't matter. Dexter could and would overpower the Ripper, and everything about his past indicates as much. This is just another area in which Dexter has the advantage, and Jack the Ripper is left looking like the foolish and incompetent amateur when compared to someone like Dexter. Ultimately, this showdown wouldn't last long. Jack would never understand that he was being analyzed and hunted. His arrogance and reliance on mystery would blind him to the fact that Dexter performs quite well in shadows far darker than those on the streets where the Ripper operated. Dexter doesn't need to match Jack's brutality because he surpasses it with his impressive knowledge of human psychology and the precision he always has when he has a known target. Jack represents the primal chaos of an early serial killer, but Dexter represents a more refined, evolved form of one. In the end, Jack the Ripper would be no more than another body on Dexter's table. He would be nothing but a cautionary example of what happens when a primitive predator crosses paths with a more perfected and morally driven version of his same species. Dexter, as usual, comes out on top. Ed Gein was born in Plainfield, Wisconsin in 1906. On the surface, he was an unassuming handyman, the kind of quiet neighbor people barely noticed. But inside his farmhouse hid one of the darkest stories in American history. Gein grew up under the unyielding control of his deeply religious mother, Augusta. She made it a point to teach him that women were evil, that the world was sinful, and that only she was pure. His father was a negligent alcoholic, and his brothers were openly skeptical of their mother's demented teachings. Unfortunately, by the time Ed reached adulthood, all of his other family had moved out, and he was left living with his mother. Of course, Augusta eventually died at some point as well, and then Ed was completely alone. And her death broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. To fill the void of his mother's presence in his life, Gein turned his obsession with her into the deranged mission of bringing her back by becoming her. When Bernice Warden, the owner of a local hardware store, went missing, the hunt for her abductor was on. Her son, who was also the town's deputy sheriff, noticed that the store's last receipt had been made out to one Ed Gein. That connection was all authorities needed to pay him a visit as they desperately tried to find her. When police finally searched his farmhouse in 1957, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Investigators truly had no idea what they were about to uncover. When police arrived, they found the front door locked, so they made their way to a shed behind the house, and there they immediately confirmed their worst fears. Bernice's body was found inside. But the real shock came when they were finally able to search inside of the house. The farmhouse was in complete disarray. It was filthy, cold, and dimly lit. It was filled with clutter, newspapers, and a stench that seasoned officers knew all too well, and newer officers would never forget. As they searched the premises, authorities began finding disturbing artifacts made from the human remains Gein had stolen. These weren't trophies in the traditional serial killer sense, but rather the results of Gein's obsession with reconstructing the image of his deceased mother. Given the state of decomposition, investigators realized that many of these items had likely come from local graves that Gein had robbed over the years. And once he was arrested, Gein openly admitted to his habit of visiting cemeteries at night, exhuming female bodies, and taking their parts home. The discovery shocked the entire nation and forever changed the way people looked at quiet, small towns. After his arrest, Ed Gein was soon declared mentally unfit for trial and committed to a psychiatric institution where he would remain for the rest of his life. But the important takeaway is that Gein wasn't a cold, calculating serial killer in the modern sense. He wasn't hunting victims for pleasure or even out of hatred. He was living in a delusional world shaped by grief, mental illness, and obsession. Does that sound like a match for Dexter Morgan? Not really, but let's look at Dexter's background to compare. Unlike Dexter, Ed Gein had no real plan, absolutely no discipline, and obviously no code. Gein's crimes were driven by insanity and compulsion, nothing like Dexter's crimes. Remember, Dexter didn't just wake up one day and decide to be a killer. He was built to be a killer, first shaped by childhood trauma and then molded by the purpose his father, Harry, gave him. We know that when Dexter was only 3 years old, he sat in a pool of his mother's blood after she was brutally murdered with a chainsaw. That moment shattered something in him and replaced it with what he calls his dark passenger, the name he assigned to the uncontrollable urge to kill he lived with every day. That's when Harry Morgan, Dexter's adoptive father and a detective for Miami Metro, found him and almost immediately saw the signs early. Instead of getting Dexter help or trying to rehabilitate him in any real way, Harry taught his son to use and control the urges rather than deny them. This was the genesis of Harry's code, starting with a few unbreakable rules. First, Dexter was never to put himself in a position to get caught, and two, he was only to kill those who deserve it, namely murderers who managed to escape justice. Under Harry's guidance, Dexter learned to blend in and wear the mask of normalcy necessary to abide by the first rule. To make this happen, Dexter studied human behavior with intense focus. He learned how to fake empathy, to mimic emotions, to appear as regular as possible in spite of everything he naturally felt inside of himself. As a result, Dexter became capable of blending into just about any space he entered. Notably, Ed Gein could never accomplish such a feat. People thought he was nice enough, but also found him to be very strange and off-putting. With the exception of Dokes, almost everyone around Dexter thought he was a charming and likable guy who was just a bit quirky or aloof at times. Harry's training was very effective for Dexter, while Ed Gein's mother made him a pariah in their small town. He had absolutely no clue how to blend in. That would be one of the first things Dexter could use against him. Ed Gein stuck out like a sore thumb. And Harry didn't just train Dexter to be normal and ethical, he also trained him to be technically advanced in his craft. He took Dexter hunting, created little tricks and puzzles for Dexter to find his way out of, before ever consenting to letting him kill a human being. Later, Dexter became a master of blood spatter analysis, forensics, and evidence handling. Today, he worked for Miami Metro, using his knowledge of science and human psychology to pin down the identity of various killers. And by night, he hunted them down himself. This balance of logic and skill with morality and predation is what makes Dexter so dangerous. Unlike more disorganized killers, he's not driven by rage or blinded by his urges. Instead, Dexter acts within a ritual and has mastered impeccable control. Every step he takes, even if it doesn't pan out perfectly, is methodical. Every move is calculated, and he can find his way out of pretty much any jam, oftentimes even predicting obstacles before they arise. So when you pit Dexter against a real-world killer like Ed Gein, you're not comparing equals. You're comparing a disciplined predator to a man completely lost to madness. Dexter would wipe the floor with him and disappear into the night before the police even knew who they were looking for. Here is why it would be so simple. Every move he makes is guided by Harry's code. From gathering proof, meticulously planning, and leaving zero evidence, it was all mapped out. He knows how investigators think, how to trace fibers, how to avoid leaving prints, and how to stage or clean a scene to perfection. Dexter doesn't just understand how to kill, he understands how killers get caught. And Ed Gein was a sloppy killer. He didn't hide his crimes well at all. It's not even clear that he really tried to. He made no effort to hide his activities or cover his tracks at all. Instead, it seemed that Gein relied on the fact that no one ever came to visit him and that no one cared to investigate grave robbing too seriously. That is where his methods would catch up with him. You see, Dexter wouldn't hesitate to give Gein's residence a visit. Dex regularly breaks into the houses of people he is vetting. If Ed Gein seemed even remotely suspicious, which obviously he does, Dexter would trust his instincts and scope out his house to confirm or clear him of guilt. Just like the police, as soon as Dexter entered the farmhouse, he would be faced with the undeniable evidence of Ed Gein's depravity. The lampshades, clothing, and other projects made from human skin and remains weren't hidden in a safe or locked away. They were on full display throughout the house, and once he found them, Ed would immediately be on Dexter's list. Ed Gein operated with almost no tactical awareness. His crimes were impulsive, messy, and left tons of physical evidence. Dexter would capitalize on that lack of caution immediately and use it to close in quickly and efficiently. But the advantages don't stop there. There is also the matter of psychological control. Dexter's second major edge is his mental discipline. He doesn't act on emotion. For Dexter, every hunt begins only after he has verified guilt and mapped out his steps. Given how lazily Ed Gein went about carrying out and hiding his crimes, Dexter would have no trouble at all tracking him down and maybe even catching him in the act. In this regard, Ed Gein was basically the opposite of Dexter. He lived in a haze of delusion, grief, and obsession with his mother. His thinking was deeply fractured. He was not a keen strategist like Dexter, but a crazed man controlled by and lost in his fantastical notion that he could become his own mother. His thought process was so off base and scattered that there is almost no way he could have seen Dexter coming, no matter how close he got. In any confrontation, Dexter's ability to stay calm under pressure would dominate. While Gein might panic, freeze, or confuse reality with hallucination, Dexter would remain focused entirely on the task at hand. Gein could be dangerous for a short moment because of his delusions, but Dexter would still be able to overpower him in the end. Dexter thrives in pretty much any environment. He can adapt to almost any setting. He can manipulate lighting, use the terrain to disappear, and improvise tools from whatever's available. Like when he had to cover up his attack of Matt Caldwell in New Blood. After hitting Matt in the face with the butt of his rifle and knocking him unconscious, Dexter expertly staged the crime scene to throw investigators off the scent of what really happened, using the snow to his advantage. He knew exactly what to do to make the details of the crime debatable, and he was only successful in doing so because of infrared cameras in the woods and the help from a highly trained outside forensic analyst who knew exactly what to look for in the event that there may have been any foul play. He also staged the crime scene of Dan the Dentist in season 5 so perfectly that there was no further investigation, and his colleagues sooner attributed the death to autoerotic mummification than assumed Dexter was involved, despite him inexplicably being the first one on the scene. He managed to do the same with the Ice Truck Killer, Miguel Prado, the Doomsday Killer, Travis Marshall, and others after taking them out. Dexter understands the physical playing field better than anyone around him, and it's just another way that he could get the upper hand on someone as disturbed as Ed Gein. Ed Gein was completely dependent on the privacy of his farmhouse. It was his only true comfort zone, but it was also a decaying space that mirrored his mental isolation and the chaos that resulted within it. Move him outside that environment and he'd be exposed, disoriented, and vulnerable. He had no clue how to navigate the world, and he'd essentially be a sitting duck as a result. Dexter would always be 3 steps ahead of someone like Ed Gein, a man who had no way of understanding the people or the world around him in a sophisticated way. Dexter could turn that isolation against him. He'd use the silence of the farm, the clutter, and the darkness to stalk Ed Gein completely unseen. To Dexter, the Gein farmhouse wouldn't be a house of horrors. It would serve as an almost ready-made kill room. Gein's safe little space would become part of his undoing. And let's keep in mind that physically, Dexter is stronger, faster, and more experienced in close combat. Years of subduing victims, using tranquilizers, restraints, and blades have made him efficient and confident against a clumsy dullard like Gein, even being around farm equipment his whole life. Ed Gein was not physically imposing or skilled in any style of self-defense. He relied on his unassuming nature and victims who couldn't fight back. In a direct confrontation, Dexter's brute force and conditioning would end the encounter in seconds. Gein had to be at least a bit strong, of course. After all, he did dig up graves and haul corpses when he wanted to, and that takes a level of strength that is at least slightly above average. Still, there's no way that the scrawny, untrained Gein would be stronger than the jiu-jitsu-trained Dexter, who regularly moved bodies and fought people far more experienced in hand-to-hand combat than Gein ever was. When it comes to strength and mobility, Dexter comes out on top, no question. Finally, we can't forget Dexter's most underrated weapon, his moral clarity. Dexter's code gives him purpose and direction. It serves as a psychological compass that almost always keeps him focused. Dexter's care for the mentally disturbed could have served as a momentary advantage for Ed Gein, but in the end, it is unlikely it would have saved him, and if it did, it wouldn't be because Dexter was incapable of catching and killing him, but because he chose not to. If we recall the case of Jeremy Downs, Dexter's concern for people who aren't fully in charge of their actions is made clear. Jeremy was a teenage boy who Dexter came into contact with after a classmate of his wound up dead. It came to light that Jeremy had been violent in the past, and after that, it was revealed that he was the victim of sexual assault as a younger child. He acted out of a numbness and the lack of support or psychological guidance that could have saved him and his victims from their terrible fates. Dexter spared his life once and tried to help him avoid prison later because he took pity on Jeremy. He saw the young man's lot in life very relatable and thought his actions to be outside of his control. Almost like a mirror image of Dexter's biological brother, the Ice Truck Killer. He could have seen Ed Gein in a similar light. Ed Gein didn't kill for sexual gratification, he didn't revel in the suffering of his victims, and he didn't target random, weaker individuals with the hope of getting away with it. He didn't cover up his crimes well, if at all, and he didn't seem to have a clear idea of what's right or wrong. He was only focused on recreating his late mother, and unfortunately for the people of the town he lived in, that meant that their loved ones, both living and past, would be used to help him do so. If Dexter knew how crazy Gein really was, he could have had a brief lapse in his own urges to kill him and decided that he was not mentally developed enough to die on his table. He might have caught it into the police like he did with Lady Vengeance and let them sort it all out. That would have allowed him to save any future potential victims of Gein's and helped him to keep his code by only killing people he thought really deserved it. But when it comes to moral clarity, keep in mind that Ed Gein had none. His actions were the result of delusion and confusion, not conviction. Dexter's clarity of purpose would give him an unshakable edge. He knows why he kills and why he doesn't. Gein, on the other hand, was a slave to his mind. He may have known on some level that killing was wrong, but how much can really be said about the mental acuity of a man who thought wearing women's skin would help him recapture his mother's presence in his life? How can anyone possibly consider someone as unwell as Ed Gein fully responsible for his crimes? He was abused, isolated, and brainwashed from a young age, kind of like Dexter. He never received any outside influence that could have steered him away from his disturbing future acts. In the end, Gein was ultimately declared legally insane and spent the rest of his life not in prison or on death row, but in a psychiatric institution. He may have been able to get the better of corpses and unsuspecting women in his immediate area, but when you put him up against someone like Dexter Morgan, the contrast couldn't be more evident. If Dexter did decide to take Ed Gein out, it would almost be a mercy killing, something that could finally free him from the grip his mother had on him even after her death. And no matter what happened, whether Ed found himself on a kill table wrapped in plastic or being hauled away by police, no part of it would be much of a chore for Dexter. When it comes to this matchup against a killer whose biggest strength is his interior decorating skills, Dexter gains the upper hand. John Wayne Gacy looked like the last person you'd suspect of being one of the most horrifying killers in American history. Gacy grew up in a strict, often abusive household in 1940s Chicago. His father was an alcoholic who berated and beat him regularly. He would often call his son effeminate nicknames and accuse him of being a closeted homosexual. That early humiliation set the stage for decades and decades of hidden rage and manipulation. Despite his troubled childhood, Gacy managed to carve out an image of success. By the time he reached young adulthood, he was a respected member of the community. He became a small business owner, a political volunteer, and even someone who entertained children, performing as Pogo the Clown. To his loved ones and his neighbors, Gacy seemed friendly and dependable, if a bit eccentric. The point is, nobody imagined that behind the painted-on clown makeup was a child predator and killer. I'm sorry, you're telling me no one suspected the clown? Gacy's crimes started in the early 1970s, and by the end of the investigation, what police found would shock the world. Gacy primarily targeted teenage boys and very young men, often luring them with promises of jobs, money, or just a fun time. He would regularly offer drugs and alcohol to his intended victims to get them to go with him willingly, but once he got them inside of his home, his targets rarely made it out. Gacy would use a handful of tricks to get the boys in a defenseless position. He'd joke to them about experimenting sexually, put on adult videos, and force-feed them alcohol, no matter their age. And he even got some of them to handcuff themselves, claiming he was teaching them a trick how to escape handcuffs. Unfortunately, once they were restrained, Gacy had them right where he wanted them. He had no intention of letting them go, and sadly for many of his victims, their lives would end and their bodies would be hidden in the now infamous crawl space. Over time, the space would quite literally become a makeshift mass grave directly under Gacy's house. Eventually, police were able to connect the missing persons reports to Gacy's area, but it still took a lot of persistent detective work before they were able to link him directly. When authorities finally searched his property, they discovered several bodies buried under the house and more found in nearby rivers. In total, it is estimated that Gacy had murdered approximately 33 people, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in US history. What made Gacy especially disturbing wasn't just the sheer number of his victims, but his two-faced nature. He could charm local officials, host neighborhood barbecues, and volunteer for community events, all while carrying out horrific acts behind closed doors. Even after his arrest, he showed little remorse, often portraying himself as a victim of circumstance or false accusations. But in 1980, his trial would reveal the true extent of his crimes. While at work one day, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest spoke with Gacy about a potential new job with higher pay, was never seen again. It was his disappearance that would lead to Gacy finally being caught. Because Robert was last known to be meeting with John Wayne Gacy, which made him a prime suspect in the disappearance. The killer denied ever meeting Robert, but investigators found a receipt from Robert's jacket pocket in Gacy's house, confirming that Gacy was indeed lying. Eventually, he was arrested and forced to answer for his crimes. During the trial, prosecutors presented photographs of what was found in his crawlspace as evidence and pointed to inconsistencies in his story to police about meeting with Piest. All of the witness testimonies culminated to paint a picture of a manipulative, sadistic man who used his charisma to lure, dominate, and eventually murder all of his innocent victims. In the end, Gacy was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection in 1994. What is so harrowing about Gacy is that he represented the darkest side of human nature, how easily predators can infiltrate a community. He was a man who wore a mask of kindness and normalcy while praying for the vulnerable. Gacy lived this way to avoid detection and throw off suspicion, but it is exactly this despicable double life that would make him a prime target for someone like Dexter. If there's one thing Dexter can't stand, it's a predator who hides behind the facade of a family man to prey on the defenseless, especially when the victims include children. What separates Dexter from people like Gacy is not only his intelligence or precision, but the moral guidelines taught to him by his adoptive father, Harry. Harry realized pretty early on that Dexter had violent urges he couldn't suppress, but instead of letting him spiral into becoming another monster, Harry redirected his son's urges. He taught Dexter how to channel his darkness into something that served some sort of justice. The code was also meant to keep Dexter out of jail and off of death row, which, as Gacy's fate shows, is the likely end for someone who lived with an unyielding desire to kill others. Dexter may have been a killer, but his code taught him to never kill an innocent. We know he would only kill those who deserve it, targeting proven killers who had managed to escape justice. The code shaped every aspect of Dexter's life. He lived every day balancing the monster inside him with the moral compass his father gave. Unlike Gacy, who killed out of sadistic pleasure, Dexter saw his killings as a dark necessity. It gave him a way to rid the world of deadly predators and keep his own urges in control, ensuring he would never intentionally target an innocent person just to satiate his needs. Over time, he became disgusted with typical killers and their willingness to murder innocent people just because they felt like it. In his eyes, killing adults was horrible enough, but when it came to children, Dexter's line was absolute. Throughout the series, Dexter has an unwavering instinct to protect kids, most likely as a reflection of his own childhood trauma. When he was just 3 years old himself, Dexter watched his mother's brutal murder and dismemberment. He was left there surrounded by blood, alone with only his brother in a shipping container and dismembered body parts, and it shaped his entire psyche. It's understandable then that when Dexter sees children in danger, he sees himself in them. There was a hidden tenderness to Dexter. He was a man capable of monstrous violence, but was still always very gentle and patient when dealing with kids. From Aster and Cody, his stepchildren, to his biological son Harrison, and even kids he doesn't know, Dexter becomes fiercely protective when children are involved in a case. He's even willing to break or adjust his code to keep them safe. In the very first episode, Dexter's first target is a man named Mike Donovan, a predatory choir director and church leader who molested and killed young boys before burying their bodies. Dexter was absolutely enraged by Donovan's crimes. When Dexter screamed in the perp's face and demanded he open his eyes and look at what he'd done, it seemed personal. To Dex, those who harm children aren't just criminals, they're the lowest of the low. Dexter knew that by killing Donovan. He was saving the lives of countless boys who were bound to end up as future victims. Given many of Gacy's victims were young boys, some as young as 14, finding out about him would instantly trigger the part of Dexter that can't tolerate such evil. And Mike Donovan wasn't the only child killer Dexter would go out of his way to get rid of. He also killed Zoe Kruger, a corrupt cop who killed her own husband and young daughter. And more notably, Dexter took out a man named Nathan Martin after catching him creeping on Aster. Martin was a registered sex offender for past crimes against children, but he was released from prison and went right back to his disgusting ways. His final mistake would be targeting Dexter's kids. Even though he wasn't a killer, meaning he didn't fit the code in a technicality, Dexter knew that Nathan would continue harming kids if he was left alive, so he broke into his house one night and strangled him to death after he caught the predator taking pictures of Astor at the beach. Dexter hated what Nathan did so much that for the first time in his life, he adjusted Harry's code, making it his own, and included child predators as viable targets for his urges. So it's obvious that if he ever met John Wayne Gacy, Dexter wouldn't hesitate to do what he needed to do. He'd investigate and vet Gacy first, of course, to confirm the truth of Gacy's crimes, and once the evidence was solid, Gacy's fate would be sealed. Unlike Gacy, who hid behind charm and lies, Dexter uses his training and intelligence to fulfill a purpose. Once both Dexter and Gacy's profiles are outlined, the outcome of a showdown between the two is all too predictable. Everything about their methods, personalities, and just their overall mentalities indicated that this matchup would never be balanced. Gacy operated on arrogance and manipulation, could become erratic when cornered, while Dexter used precision, solid evidence, facts, and almost always maintained his composure. The hunt would be one-sided from the moment Dexter noticed Gacy's pattern. But how would he do that? Gacy was under the radar for so long, so how would Dexter edge out the police to get Gacy on his table? First, we need to keep in mind that Dexter's entire approach to finding potential targets begins with pattern recognition. He doesn't act on pure instinct alone, and he tries to keep his personal emotion out of his vetting process. Instead, Dexter relies on the facts uncovered through forensics. So for Dexter, the discovery of Gacy's pattern would begin with the news that a boy was missing, the fact that Gacy's victims were all last seen with him. Once Dexter uncovered the long series of missing persons cases in the area that all share unsettling similarities, he wouldn't stop until he got to the bottom of it all. Dexter would realize that each disappearance involved a young man, usually between the ages of 14 and 21, who had last been seen with a local contractor promising a good time or quick work with high pay. To ordinary investigators, these cases might have looked like isolated cases of runaways, but to someone like Dexter, whose entire career is built around connecting the dots and making sense out of chaos, the truth would be undeniable. The consistent victim profile, the proximity of each disappearance to one another, all in the same area of Illinois, and the consistent link to a single community member would stand out to Dexter immediately. Once he verified that John Wayne Gacy was connected to all known victims, the case would move from speculation to certainty for Dexter. In next to no time, Gacy would be the obvious suspect, and the real vetting could begin. Much like he has with Nathan Martin and with so many others, Dexter would easily break into Gacy's home to gather concrete evidence of his guilt. If the stench of decaying bodies didn't set off the alarm bells in Dexter's lizard brain, the items from the missing boys being around Gacy's home would. From the Tooth Fairy to Kurt Caldwell, Dexter had no problem tracking down the trophies of a killer, no matter how well they were hidden. Dexter has been able to find the keepsakes his targets kept to remember their kills. When going through Gacy's house, Dexter would undoubtedly run into one piece of evidence after another. Each item he found that was linked to one of the missing people would confirm to him that Gacy knew more than he was letting on and was almost certainly responsible for the disappearances. But going back to the smell, Dexter would recognize it immediately, and with enough time, he would be able to find where the bodies were stashed before Gacy returned home. Keep in mind that the ungodly smell in Gacy's home was the result of his foolishly keeping the bodies of his victims in the crawl space beneath the house. It was the disappearance of Robert P.S. that led investigators to look into Gacy, but it was the foul odor that emanated from his vents that sealed his fate. Detectives knew that there had to be a dead body in the house the second they caught a single whiff of the putrid smell, but they had to go through the proper channels and obtain a search warrant before they could look any further. Dexter obviously wouldn't have that problem. He could find the trophies, investigate the smell, find the bodies, and be out of the house with no problem. Then the only matter would be studying Gacy's routine and determining the best time to strike. Gacy was twice divorced, and although he had children, They were never around. He lived by himself, which would make getting Gacy alone and strapped to a kill table no problem for Dexter. This would also make it an easy location for Dexter to set up the kill room. Because Gacy was always trying to impress people and didn't mind socializing, getting to Gacy would be like shooting fish in a barrel for Dex. Gacy was attracted to younger men, but if Dexter presented himself as a gay man looking for a good time, he could have enticed a drunken Gacy to invite him back to his place. Gacy was a lonely drunk with a ridiculously oversized ego. His arrogance would probably keep him from realizing or even considering that Dexter was a threat to him. If Dexter caught up with Gacy at one of the places around town he frequented, like a bar or a club, and started chatting him up, he'd likely be able to convince Gacy to hang out with him alone. The rest would be history. As soon as they were out of the sight of anyone else, Dexter could inject Gacy with M99 and handle his business. John Wayne Gacy was by no means a small guy, but that has never stopped Dexter before. He has taken on plenty of killers who outmatched his size and still came out on top. Gacy wasn't a fighter. He didn't threaten his victims with physical violence to get them to comply. He lied to them and tricked them into thinking they would get something of value by hanging out with them. He didn't subdue with brute force either. He got them drunk. He made sure many were handcuffed before the true horrors began. He was out of shape, overweight, and clearly lacked confidence in his ability to overpower his victims, despite the fact that he was older and larger than all of them. Dexter doesn't suffer from those limitations. He's closer to a trained athlete or a trained fighter. Dexter has years of experience taking down killers in a variety of ways. Even if he didn't want to try and take Gacy in hand-to-hand combat, he'd be open to trying it if necessary, and he'd probably fare pretty well because Gacy was a coward. If he wouldn't try fighting a 14-year-old boy, there's no way he'd try to physically attack Dexter. And his little handcuff trick wouldn't get him too far either. Remember that Dexter has already fought his way to freedom while handcuffed with a gunshot wound to the leg, while struggling for his life in a lake. Even with all of those disadvantages, he managed to incapacitate Sergeant Dokes, who is way stronger and physically menacing than John Wayne Gacy. That means that even if Gacy did manage to get Dexter in cuffs, he wouldn't be out of the woods by a long shot. And once the tranquilizer was administered, it would all be over for him. Whether Dexter convinced Gacy to invite him into his home or lied in wait for him to return and ambushed him, there is just no chance in hell that Gacy would have gotten the upper hand on someone as prepared and skilled as Dexter. Sure, Dexter only exists as a fictional embodiment of controlled vigilante justice, but John Wayne Gacy is a case study in uncontrolled depravity. When all factors are weighed, Dexter's advantage over Gacy is obvious. Dexter's intelligence and training combined with his motives and morality ensure that there is no real contest. Gacy's downfall was the result of arrogance and carelessness, but Dexter's continued survival is a testament to his efficiency and discipline. Gacy is sloppy and overly self-assured. You pair that with his impulsive nature and lack of any physical training, and you're looking at an easy victim for Dexter. He would have more wrath for a child predator like Gacy than most other targets, but it wouldn't distract him from the task at hand. If anything, it may even serve as motivation to get the job done as quickly and cleanly as possible. After Gacy was taken care of, the only thing Dexter left behind would be an empty house and a safer community. If they ever did cross paths, Gacy's legacy of horror would end before he could victimize any more young men and long before police could uncover it. It wouldn't be a battle. It would be the quick, efficient execution of a murderous madman. When the chaos of Gacy meets the calm control of Dexter Morgan, there is no question who would win. Do you think Dexter could take Gacy down? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this analysis, check out our in-depth breakdown of Dexter versus Jack the Ripper. Please take a moment to consider taking out all your frustrations and slashing the subscribe button for more Dexter videos. Thanks for watching.